Right, depending on who you ask out there, there's a number of definitions between survival and bushcraft and preparedness. What it means to you and who you ask is really important, especially in the context of learning someone else's system. So I think it's important that we get on the same page with that, and I give you my definition of those three and kind of how I see them playing a role with each other. All right, survival means nothing more than to stay alive, and it often means to stay alive under despite difficult circumstances. Then bushcraft is really all it means is skill in the wilderness or skill in the woods, skill in the bush. The preparedness to me is kind of a longer term application of survival and bushcraft skills, but it's in an unknown environment, and it's for what could be an extended period of time, and there's no guarantee when that time frame is going to end, and there's also no guarantee of a return to any sense of normalcy. So to me, preparedness is not that much different. You're trying to stay alive in difficult circumstances. You're using different skills, whether you consider them survival or bushcraft, it doesn't matter, because in my opinion, survival skills really help your bushcraft ability and bushcraft skills help your survivability. So all of those kind of play together. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because that helps you kind of prioritize and that helps you plan for these types of emergency kind of situations. So if we look at it from kind of the survival context, the survival lens, you have certain priorities. You have core temperature control. That's something that's a need, right? And I like to break it down into metabolic needs, preventative needs, and then supplemental needs. These are things that you need to think about and prioritize to accomplish to affect your survival. And just, again, preparedness is nothing more than possibly a long-term application of that, is trying to stay alive in a difficult circumstance. So regardless of what the situation is, your needs don't actually change. So they're going to sound a lot like the survival priorities, because essentially your metabolic needs are your metabolic needs, right? You need core temperature control. What we're doing for core temperature control is typically that starts with your first line of shelter, which is your clothing system. Having the appropriate clothing on for the environment that you find yourself in is step one to maintaining your body's core temperature. After that, you have fire, you have shelter. Those are all things that are all working together to help you maintain your body's core temperature. Another metabolic need is the need for hydration. You need water. You need to be able to procure it. You need to be able to possibly disinfect it, depending on what the source is. So that's another metabolic need. Then the consumption of calories, that's another metabolic need. Yes, we can go a long time without food, but you still need food for energy. That's what's fueling everything that you do. And while it's not a huge priority, it's still really important. You need to consume calories, especially for a situation like a bug out and you're on foot, which is kind of a worst case kind of thing. You need to be able to kind of log those miles and get to where you're going as quickly as possible. So that is a metabolic need that we need to think about and be concerned with. After your metabolic needs, and also a metabolic need that could be there, but it also could be a preventative. But if you have a life-threatening emergency, if whatever it was that drove you out of your house or wherever you were bugging in, if that includes a life-threatening injury, you need to be able to handle that. So that may be an immediate metabolic need that you need to take care of. But at a minimum, first aid is a preventative. There are, injuries that you could sustain, like a twisted ankle, that if you can fix that, you can keep going, so it's a preventative. It prevents you from being stranded somewhere. You also have to have the ability to navigate. A lot of times within the survival industry and the survival world, if you can navigate and just go home, you don't have to worry about all the other stuff because you're not stuck anywhere. So the ability to navigate is a good preventative need. And then within the scope of survival, signal is kind of one of those important things. If you can't fix yourself or you get lost, you might want to signal for rescue. In the context of preparedness, signal is more, kind of think of signal as communications. You need to be able to communicate with other people in your community. You want to be able to communicate only with people that you want to find you. You may be in a situation to where you're not trying to get anyone's attention at all. You're trying to lay low, get from point A to point B with you, or possibly you and your family. So think of signal and communications in the context of preparedness as kind of the same thing. So those are your preventatives. And then your supplemental needs or your facilitative needs are things like tools, right? Tools are resources that you can use to help you with your metabolic needs and help you with your preventative needs. Like these are the items, the resources you're using to affect all of those. So those are kind of in the context of survival, which again, preparedness is a long-term application of those, potentially long-term anyway. There's a couple more that you need to think about when we start moving out of the kind of survival lens and looking at it through the preparedness lens, aside from the communication that we talked about before. Security is much more of a concern from the prepper's perspective, if you will. It's much more of a concern. You need to have, security 360 degrees all around you at all times, 24/7. So you need to think about that. And with that said, the other priority, the other thing that you need to think about in any type of preparedness thing is the establishment of community, right? You cannot do it by yourself. The lone wolf thing is not something you're going to be able to sustain for a very long period of time. So you need to think about, before any of this, you need to start thinking about and establishing a community of like-minded people that are going to work well together, pull together in some type of a crisis, and help each other out through this. You cannot do it alone. It's not possible to not only provide security for yourself and your family, but also provide for the needs, because you'll drop security to go provide for those needs. So you need to think about that, and you need to just, take a moment to convince yourself that community is probably the most important piece of this equation. So when you're thinking about community, think about the priorities that you need to provide for, and think about how you're going to do that on a longer term scale. So when you think about that and you're establishing a community, and another thing to think about is to staff your weaknesses. All right, you're building a community of people that have different skills, but they're like-minded and want to work together to help each other, and kind of share the wealth, share the burden, cross-train each other so that the skills are not lost, that sort of thing. So when you're thinking about that, you want to have someone that's really good at wilderness survival, for example, but you also want to have the guy or gal that's good at horticulture and gardening and greenhouse. You need a guy that knows something about livestock. If you're going to have long-term food available in your community, you need to think about that. You need to have craftsmen that are good with working with natural resources like wood, like metal, like clay, like glass, because you're going to be able to use natural resources and turn those into things that are going to help your community in this type of a situation long term. So when you're putting your plan together, that's what I want you to think about, is staffing your weaknesses and building a community that will work well together, and you can accomplish everything you need to accomplish if you do that. What I don't want you to do is think that you're going to be that lone wolf that grabs a bug out bag and disappears off into the wilderness, because you're not going to be able to secure yourself. You're not going to be able to sustain yourself for very long doing that, and that should not be part of your plan. And I tell you about community now, even though we're not going to cover that much in this film. I tell you that now because if we're talking about bugging out and grabbing a bag and taking off, your goal should be to take off and go to an alternate location where the rest of your community is going to consolidate and work together for as long as it takes. The time to establish that community is now. It's not after something happens. That's the important takeaway, and why I want to get your gears turning on establishing that community. And then part of your planning process, which is what we will talk about quite a bit in this film, it should be the establishment of that community, deciding who's part of that community, what skills they're bringing, what are some of the triggers that would cause you to leave your particular locations. You may have different lives. You probably don't live together now. You have somebody living here, somebody living here, somebody living here. You all have these different skills, and you're going to come together. But what are the triggers to get you guys there? And then, of course, when are you going to do that, and where are you going to link up? What's that alternate bug out location that everyone is going to link up at, so that you can kind of affect survival? And if you haven't planned that before it's time to grab that bag and head out the door, then you've really done yourself a disservice. So I just want you to think about that and keep that in mind during this planning process.